hear me okay?
There's a buzz.
It's him.
There, that's better. Oh,
Maybe I just gotta,
Fool it.
okay, well, I'm supposed to talk about the funeral home. And that's an interesting topic for everybody. Everyone has their own idea of how they want their final departure to be. And I've maintained my license as a funeral director, and occasionally work with Sean Fahey, who I asked to take over the funeral home because I knew Sean would run it as I was accustomed to running it and keep it a small hometown funeral home. Sean is with us tonight. Sean, raise your hand or stand up or whatever. And he certainly runs a great place for us. A funeral director has to be a psychological counselor, has to be a hairdresser, a cosmetologist, has to be a fashion person, has to be any one of a number of a referee on occasions, and trust me, we've had to do that on occasions. As I talk to you tonight, I may name some incidences that happened, but I won't name the people. It's not like Dragnet where the names have been changed to protect the innocent. There'll be no names. Okay, so, but I want to share with you some of the things that have occurred and how funeral service has changed through the years. My neighbor growing up says I was destined to be a funeral director because I made her attend a funeral for a sparrow that had hit our window, and I buried the sparrow and held a small prayer vigil and made her come and attend. And she says that's when I first started funeral directing. I saw my first deceased person when my uncle died when I was 12 years old. And it was quite an experience. It was January, one of those cold, blustery January nights, and my mother and father decided that we should be acquainted with death. So we went to the funeral home when it was in the little house by the print shop over here. And when we walked in, and my sister was very, very nervous. It was my twin sister, and she was very, very nervous. And when we walked in, I could see the casket was in 2 rooms down, but my uncle was laid out. And I could see he had a Jordan nose, and it was sticking up over the edge of the casket. And I said, "Oh, there's our uncle." And my sister said, "How do you know?" "I can see his nose." And I was so surprised because I'd seen so many times on TV that I thought the casket was going to be up in the corner standing up and that he would be in the casket. And I was so surprised to see him laying down, you know, and I thought, this is sort of not the way I thought it would be. So it was one of those cold, blustery nights, so my sister and I didn't want to stay in the room with a dead person, even though he was our uncle. So we walked home, and as we walked across the bridge down by the mill stream, a hay truck tipped over on the bridge right behind us, and we thought that was some sort of an omen, okay? And so it intrigued me about how does it all come together, you know, how does it all work? And when I bought the Turk house, Catherine Turk Truman made it possible for me to buy the house, and some of you remember Catherine. If you knew her, you will remember her. She gave me a good deal on the house, and I didn't buy it with the intentions of having a funeral home there. I just liked the house, and everybody told me it was going to cave in and everything, but it didn't, you know. And I finally decided I had an acquaintance over in Berkshire that worked at Cornell, but he had his funeral director's license, and I said, you know, I think this house would make a nice funeral home. And so he said, well, I will put my license there if you want to open a funeral home. What do we name it? And I says, well, everyone in Candor says when someone dies, are you going to the funeral parlor tonight? So I said, I guess the only thing we can name it is the Candor Funeral Parlor. And it was the old-fashioned name, but the funeral parlor fit, so that's what we did. And we opened, and we didn't have a call for several months when we first opened, because family loyalty stays with a funeral home that has been for generations usually. And but I got a call one day, and it was Paul Blow. Some of you will remember Paul Blow for various reasons. And Paul Blow says, I'm going to be your first funeral call. And he had been diagnosed as terminal. And he says, I will be your first funeral call. And he says, I think that might bring you some other business. So it was a big step for us, a first call with the Justice of the Peace and a guy that knew so many different people. And we were thrilled that he asked us to do his funeral. Paul is buried in Tioga Cemetery in Owego. And about 3 weeks before Paul died, we had bought a gray station wagon that we were using as a removal vehicle and a hearse. And we bought it off of the car dealership up by Moore's Tire Service. What was the name of that?
Trabuco?
Trabuco. We bought it there. And I was to pick it up on a Thursday morning, and I get a call on Thursday morning, and they said to me, we have some bad news for you. Somebody broke in last night, took the keys out of the box, got in the car, and backed it through our door, and it was your car. So I said, well, we need the car because we need a removal vehicle, and we need something to transport to the cemetery. So they fixed it rather quickly, and we had it to use for the first funeral. So some of you may remember Kevin Sharp, who was my first partner in the firm, little short fella. And we were driving down, we went to Tioga Cemetery down Glenmary. And by the Goodrich Grange is a railroad track that goes up by the Moose Club. We took that railroad track, and there was no signal on the track, but the train that was coming towards us quite rapidly, I said, oh my God, Kevin, there's a train coming. And he goosed it, and we got across the track, and I don't think Paul minded, but we got him there, and I said, my God, I don't know what I'd tell Kay if we knew that Paul was shipped out by train. So we made it. We survived, and we got that going. Then one of our next calls was a young man who had drowned over the Thanksgiving weekend, and that was a very traumatic call, because when somebody young dies, for a funeral director, it's a little bit more traumatic because you can't understand it always. And so that was a difficult call for us, but we got through that. And some of the things that happen that people don't know about in funeral directing is something could suddenly take place and the family could be on your doorstep, and how are you going to take care of it before they get in, you know? And I've had a few of those incidences. For instance, I was meeting with a family and the furnace blew up and I had to call the fire department. And so I moved them into the front room and they came in the side door and took care of the fire. And made the arrangements for the family as the fire company was in the cellar taking care of the fire. Then one time, the family had just pulled up out front, bitter cold day, and all of a sudden, water started coming down through the chandelier. And I said to Kevin, I says, well, that isn't supposed to be that way, is it? He says, no, not really. And the pipes in the bathroom upstairs above the chandelier had froze and burst. And so I said to Kevin, keep them in the front room and I'll take care of things. And so I had the rinse the wet back going, and I got the water shut off upstairs, and we were only 5 minutes late for starting the funeral, but we got it done, and that's that way. I had a man working for me, David was his name, wonderful creative person, wonderful man, but he was a little bit OCD, and he had his way of doing things, and it certainly wasn't my way of doing things. And as you know, I do a lot of the funerals as a minister, so it was a nice warm day, and I brought the flower van out and parked it in front of the funeral home, and just sort of in front of the house next door to me. And David brought the hearse out. Now remember, I said he's a little bit OCD, but he brought the hearse out and drove right up close to the back of the flower van. And I says, well, David, you're going to have to get in the back of the van to put flowers in. Don't you think you got a little close? And he says, well, I'll move the van. And I says, well, if you would have parked back, you wouldn't have to move the van. And he said to me, and I was in my collar, he says to me, I always park the hearse with the knob of the lock on the passenger door lined up with the knot in that maple tree. Everyone's coming to the funeral, and the minister's standing outside swearing at the top of his lungs, saying, I hope that's the only thing you do to that maple tree. And I said, if I had a chainsaw, we would be late starting the service, because I would bring the tree down. And I love antiques, and I had a pillow with a cherub on that was a nude cherub, and he was afraid the public might take offense to that cherub. So I would put the cherub in the corner of a chair, and I'd be gone, come back, and it'd be turned around so no one could see that cherub. And that went on for several months. He would do that. Turn it around, I'd turn it back around. He'd turn it around, back around. So I took embalming thread, which is a very strong thread, and I sewed it in the corner of the chair. And he never turned it around again after that. And sometimes you just have to take care of things like that. Nowadays at a funeral, we have to deal with people from a distance. Often people die at a distance. Often we have to deal with families that are yours, mine, and ours. And they all have their own ideas of how they want to do things. And I remember doing one funeral where the woman had some beautiful diamond rings. And I stood at calling hours, and she did not have any children. She had several nieces, and she had 5 nieces, as a matter of fact. So first one niece comes up to me and says, I'm supposed to get those diamonds, so make sure that I get them after the funeral. She was gone about 3 minutes. Another niece comes up and says, my aunt wanted me to have those diamonds, so if you would give them to me after the funeral tomorrow, I would appreciate that. All 5 women came up to me and said, I'm to get the diamonds. And I thought, my gosh, what am I gonna do? I could bury her with them and then give them each a shovel and see who could dig. But what I did was I called her attorney and I said, explained the situation to him, and I says, my suggestion would be, is have them all come to your office, toss the rings in the air, and have them grovel for the rings, because that's what they're doing here. Okay, and so there's all kinds of things like that. And one of the transitions from why we have funeral service is it's very hard to make the transition from a physical life to the spiritual life for people. And often people put things into the casket that you think, really? Probably the most bizarre thing, I had a person who loved country music. And so the family got a cassette recorder and got his favorite song and had a recorder that could play back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. And as we closed the casket, we started the recorder. At the cemetery, you could still hear the music fading as the casket dropped into the grave. And so it's interesting what people perceive at a time of death. One of the other things that I think is interesting is how the attire has changed, not only for the deceased, but for people coming to the funeral home. Used to be that men were always laid out in a suit and tie. You know, as a matter of fact, my father, he always kept his suit in the closet in a place where we could find it, because that's what I'm going to be laid out in. Because he only had one suit and one tie. Okay, so that's why he was going to be laid out in. But now it's to be comfortable. Jeans, a sweatshirt, whatever. And people, I don't know, many of you would remember going to funerals in the 50s and early 60s where the women would always wear a hat, gloves, and shoes and pocketbook that matched. And they always dressed to the nines, and the men always wore a suit and tie. I'm not saying the change is wrong, but yet I feel like it's a sacred time period and that you should, you know, be comfortable, but also be appropriate. And nowadays that there's so many funerals that don't even take place. And I think a traditional funeral, one of the things I did in my master's degree, my thesis, was on the role of funeral service in the death process in grieving. And I interviewed many different people, and many of the older people really saw the need for seeing their loved one comfortable and dressed appropriate. The younger people, they didn't want to deal with it. They just didn't want to deal with it. And I think if you're seeing somebody who is sick, and then you see them in the funeral home where they do look comfortable and they look more like they did when they were alive, I think that can help to make that transition from a deceased body and that their loved one is gone on. When we were young, my mother always said, you have to touch a dead person and your fear of death will be gone. And so when my mother died, we went up and touched her. But it was true. The person you knew that kept that body alive was gone. You know, and you just hope they went to a good place, you know. And if you look at or touch a deceased person, you just know that the person you knew and loved is no longer there. And that's why I think that a viewing is a very essential and important thing. People like cremations now. It's very much, when we first opened, we might have had 2 a year. Now it's probably 60% a year. But I think that even with a cremation, I think it's very important for grief to see that person, unless of course they're not a viewable death, you know. So I think that that's extremely important, that you have that part of tradition. And we talk about tradition and how it's changed. When I first started the funeral service and doing calls, it was very common for somebody at the cemetery to throw themselves across the casket and scream and carry on and have to be dragged away. And now you don't see that. People maybe have accepted death more as a part of life as far as that goes. So I think that that's a very important thing, to have as much tradition as you can in funeral service. I think that probably one of my second call we had was on July 4th weekend. A man had died, and Kevin, who lives in Berkshire, I was living upstairs in the funeral home, and he says, "Now I want you to go down 2 or 3 times and check the body and make sure everything's okay." And I says, "Oh, okay." Well, wouldn't you know that we had a very violent thunderstorm, and it thunderstormed all night long. And the power went out about 11 o'clock at night, and I had a candle. So I'm sneaking in the preparation room like this guy, I hope you're still here, you know, and I go in with the candle, and I look, and I say, yeah, he's still here. And then I had to go upstairs by myself and know that he was still here, and I was up there, and the lights were out, and the thunderstorm was going, and that big house, and the lightning was lighting up the rooms of the house, and I was going down the stairs and checking with the candle, and touching the guy, and making sure everything was okay. And so that was one of my first experiences in being alone with the person. And I think that the thing with a small town funeral home is that the people you work with are part of your family. They're part of your community. They know your needs, and they know what you need to do, and they help you with that. And so many of the city funeral homes, it's such a mechanized thing that, you know, they get you to hire a limousine, they get you to, the pallbearers all wear white gloves, and at the end they take them off and put them on the casket before it's lowered into the grave, and all that stuff is in city funeral homes. And in Candor, people would say, what the hell's going on here? You know, and why are you doing this? And I think the funeral service itself has changed a lot. I think now we focus on the person's life and not their death. I think we tend to want to make the family feel as comfortable as possible. And I think that they've just begun a program now called the Celebration of Life, where they have different cards for the family with pictures of the deceased at various times in their life. And I think that that's a good thing, because I think it makes people much more comfortable as far as that goes. One of the things nowadays is cremation, and they like to scatter the ashes. And no one wants to scatter the ashes, so it's usually up to the funeral director to scatter the ashes. So I was scattering the ashes for a family way up on a hill, and I stood where the wind was blowing towards me. And I did the funeral, so I was wearing my black clergy outfit, and I went to scatter the ashes, and I scattered them in the sign of a cross, and I looked down and my black pants had turned gray. So I took half of their loved one home with me. So, but they returned to earth you know, after the laundry. But anyway, so that's some of the things you don't always think about as far as that goes. One of the first funerals that I helped as a pallbearer was an uncle who died, and before they had a device to lower the casket into the ground, some of you may be old enough to remember, they used ropes. And they would have 6 men or 8 men with ropes under the casket. They'd take the boards out from under the casket and slowly lower the ropes down. And so I was honored at the age of 12 to be one of the people to lower the casket with ropes. And as we're going down, my father says, you know, if this suddenly goes, let go of it or you're going to end up in there with him. And I thought, oh gosh, I don't think I want to do that as far as that goes. But there's many different ways that people handle grief. Many different ways that people handle grief. You can read in the paper that people put in memoriams in the paper. And I guess that brings them comfort. For me, I read them and it says things like, you died 27 years ago today, I miss you more today than I did the day you died. And I think 27 years and you ain't got over it yet? You know, I just don't quite understand that. But I mean, that's their way of handling the grief. So that's okay. That's okay. I had one funeral when the man asked me to be the minister, and he says, the only thing I want you to say is that I was an old bastard. So I thought, well, I can't say that at the funeral. That's what I want you to say. So I started the funeral out saying, so-and-so wanted me to say he was an old bastard. So I've said it, and you all know it. So, so we've got that accomplished. Then I went on to tell some of the good things he did, okay? Because I really believe that our journey in life is to honor the good things at our passing. You know, and we all have had difficulties in life, and we've had some bad times, and we've all had tragedies in our life, but we've walked through them. And the funeral should be about the person, about the person. I don't think I've ever done a half hour long, because I think people need to hear about the person. And I've always said I read a couple scriptures, but people can read the Bible at home if they need to, you know, and I don't dwell on that. I dwell on the person, how they express the Spirit of God in their life. And I think of the people that have touched my life in a very special way. There was this gal, well, her nickname was Big Red. And she was a tall, red-headed woman. And I was out in the garden at the funeral home one day doing some gardening, and she stopped by and she says, Philip, I'm here to make my funeral arrangements. And I says, well, let me go in and get the paperwork. Oh, no, I'm just going to tell you what I want. And I says, oh, really? Okay. Well, can I go in and get paper and write it down? She says, no, you don't have to. She says, when I die, I just I want you to stick a soup bone in my mouth and let the dogs drag me away. And I said to her, I says, well, you know, I said, I only have a dog that's part Basset Hound and part Lab. I said, I don't think she can drag you away. She says, you better get a bigger dog. She says, because some days I don't feel so good. And some of you remember Ken Dykeman. And Ken Dykeman did a lot of gardening and landscaping around town. And one day he comes to me and he says, did you ever find my hand? I says, your hand? And you remember that he had lost a hand and had a hook on his arm. Ken lost his hand mulching leaves in that garden at the funeral home. And so he says, did you ever find my hand? I says, not yet, but I'll look. You know, I'll look as far as I go. So there's so many wonderful stories about that I just can't share with you because of anonymity, but one of the things, especially with men funeral directors, is they don't always want to do the cosmetology or the hair. You learn how to do hair in mortuary school. You're called a deserologist. And but I did the hair in the funeral home. I did the makeup in the funeral home, and I had a woman that she always wore her hair a certain way. And she had very long hair, and she would put it together in a ponytail, bring it up over her head, and make bangs out of the end of her hair. And so when she died, her niece, who arranged the funeral, says, I just wish we could get my aunt's hair the way she always wore. I said, I can do that, that's no problem. I studied her when she was, long before I was a funeral director. So I put her hair in a ponytail, brought it up over her head, made her bangs, and the niece couldn't believe that I could remember how she wore her hair. Some of you will remember her, and I know I can mention her name. It was Georgia Galpin, Georgia Koski. She worked as a waitress down at the Brush and Palette, and I waited tables there some, so I got to know Georgia, and she went out with her hair the way it should have been. And that's really important for a family. And there's also, for funeral directors, you get poor people that don't have proper attire. I've sent more of my suit coats to the cemetery than I probably ever will own in the future because somebody needed a suit coat. So I went and I had this really poor person and he didn't have a suit coat, so I put a suit coat, one of mine on, looked like a Cornell professor by the time he left. And so I think that's really important, is to let the family know they're cared for, that they're loved. And I think that as we continue our journey in life, it's very important. One of the comments people make when they see someone laid out is, that don't look like my mother. That don't look like my mother. That don't look like my father. Well, I figured out in my studies, in my work, that why doesn't it look like your loved one? And you know what the answer to that is? We never see our loved one with their mouth shut. And when they see him in the casket with their mouth shut, it don't look like them. You know, so I always thought, maybe I should work it like those dolls with a string in there where I could just pull it, you know, and make that way. There's so many things that people don't understand that go on in the funeral home, and some of those things, it's good you don't know what goes on, especially with preparation and things. But there's so many tales of funeral directors through the years, and one of them is that, you know, they have to break your bones to put your clothes on you. That never happens. That never happens. You know, they have to cut your clothes right up the back to get them on you. That never happens. You're put on your clothing. We dress you just like you would be a living person. And we do that with ultimate respect, because we know that we're doing the last thing that we can do for a loved one. And we do it with ultimate respect. Probably one of the most difficult cases I ever did was a little 3-year-old girl who had died at the hands of another person. And I had to, it was a time that I was running the funeral home by myself, and I had to do the preparation work. And I kept telling myself, you know, Phil, this is the last thing you can do for this little girl and for her family. And when I got done, she looked just like a little angel. And I still get goosebumps talking about it because, you know, that helped the family so much to see her other than the way that they found her. So that's really important, the care and concern that we have for the funeral home and for the people that we deal with. When I knew I was going to get out of the funeral home, I called Sean at the Owego Esty Monroe and Fahey Funeral Home, and I said, Sean, you're the only person I know that I would want to take over my funeral home, and I want you to buy it. And he did. And so I think that he renovated it, and he runs a very nice place there as far as that goes. And of course, I do a lot of the funerals there because, as you heard a few times ago, I was the paper boy in Candor for 25 years. And so I knew everything. I knew all the dirt on everybody. And I know everyone, when I preach a funeral, everyone's sitting there thinking, I don't know whether he'll say what he's supposed to say or not. I hope he doesn't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God. You know, but that's what it's about. When we have a funeral for a loved one, it's their day. And I always think, I'm standing here praying for this loved one who went to heaven 3 days ago, and here we're trying to get them in heaven today. They're already there. They're probably thinking, that's sort of stupid. You should have done it the first day. And but I think that I'm always very honored to be with a family at their time of loss, because I think that as a funeral director, it's an important occupation and profession. And I think it's very important to the family to have someone that turns their loved one over to somebody who really does care. And I think that is so very important as far as that goes. We had sadness today. One of our fellow people at the funeral home passed away this morning. Some of you may remember Bobby Shady. He had Lou Gehrig's disease and had a terrible ending in his life. I went down and did prayers with him yesterday morning, and he died at 4:30 this morning. His funeral will be at St. Pat's on November 4th, and calling hours will be in the afternoon of the 3rd, I believe, is how it's going to be. And Bobby asked me 2 years ago, after he heard some of my funerals, he says, I want you to do the eulogy at my funeral. And I says, well, then do something good so I can say something good. And which I always say to people. But Bobby certainly was a wonderful example of what God wants for all of us. I told him a week ago when I was with him and he was in the hospital, I said, you know, you were the idol of every boy in school. You were...
And girl.
And girl. I was getting to that. But every boy wanted to be the athlete that Bobby was. And he was a farm boy, and he would do his chores and do his basketball and his football, and he was just a wonderful athlete. But even more so, he was a wonderful father, wonderful husband, grandfather, and most of all, a friend. He was just a person who never had a bad word to say about anybody.
Are you practicing on us?
No. I never know what I'm going to say. That's one thing about me in church and in funerals. I have never written a eulogy and never written a sermon in my life. I don't, because I would have to get all lost when I went and looked at it. I've never prepared for this tonight. God gave me the Irish gift of gab, so, as you all know. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be here, and I certainly enjoy talking. At some time, I should talk about some of the police work I've done with my psychic work.
Yes.
That would be an interesting thing. Some of you don't know, but I've had 20 episodes on Court TV of homicides that I have solved that were cold cases. And
We'll put you on the agenda for next year.
okay, if I'm still here, you know. So,
Understood.
are there any questions that anyone wants to ask? Yes.
I remember you telling a story about the death of a young mom with young children. And the calling hours were held in the home. And you were showing the children the casket ahead of time. Do you remember that story?
Yeah. And the woman had had cancer and had diminished greatly with cancer, and she had 4 children, I think. And so we took the casket, she wanted to be in her own home, so we took the casket to her own home, and I opened the casket up fully because children sometimes think that because it's called a half-couch casket, where the bottom's closed, and oddly enough in Pennsylvania, most of the caskets are fully open, the whole casket's open. But in New York, the kids think they've cut their mother in half. So I opened up the whole casket and then I explained to them everything that was happening, and it really helped to assuage their grief, I think, as far as that goes. I've written a book.
What was the question? One of the littlest one asked you.
Oh, I can't remember.
She had spent her life making sure mom was comfortable.
Oh, that's
And so she asked you if she could try it out.
right, yeah, yeah. I've written a book on grief with children. It's called Mrs. Quigley Died One Day. There's 18 copies here. Anyone that wants one can take one. And there's a workbook in the back that offers questions to be answered for the adults as well as for the children. Like, what did you like most about the deceased? What did you like least? What was their favorite color? What was their favorite food? Things of that nature. And I think that's something that if they fill it out, like at a young age when they get older, they can look back at it and it will help them to remember their loved one even more. But it was written as a poem type thing that came to me. I wrote it in 20 minutes. And so anyone that would like a copy, it certainly is there for you. Any other questions?
What years did you have the funeral here?
We opened the funeral home in November of 1985. And I think I sold it in 09 maybe. I think Sean's had it 10 years. So I was licensed in 1989. You have to do your training, your education, then you have to do a 1-year internship, apprenticeship, and you have to do it in a licensed funeral home and with a funeral director that will oversee you. Very hard to get anyone to take you because they're family-run businesses and their sons or daughters go on and you know, they don't want to take somebody in. But I had a man who became like a dad to me. His name was Mel Lovell in Waverly. And he just worshiped me and I worshiped him. And whenever we had a call, I drove, no matter what the weather was, middle of the night, I drove one night 3 times to Waverly to prepare a person for burial. And he just was wonderful. I was just out of school and we had a terrible accident where a young man had been broadsided by a tractor trailer and his face was just shredded. And the mother was in Tennessee away and she hadn't seen him for a year. And she says, I have to see my son. And Mel said to her, there's no way you can see him. And he took me to one side and said, do you think you could fix him up so he's presentable? And I said, a lot of times in a case like that, they'll put a veil across the top of the casket, so when you're looking through, you can see them, but you can't see them. And that's sort of a cheater's way out, but I worked over 6 hours stitching, and I made him presentable enough that they had an open casket funeral. And that is so rewarding. Then one night I was doing my internship, and it was night I had 2 calls. One was a man they found who was one of the town characters, and they found him in a ditch. He had died, and he had been drinking, and he died. And I prepared him, and there was another woman that was very wealthy, very, very wealthy, and I did her, and they looked beautiful, they were very nice. And Mel says to me, he says, "You can't really tell which one was rich and which one was not, can you?" And I said, "No." He says, "That's because you did a good job." And so that really pleases me, you know, that when you get that. Recently I was with a family, and they said, "Your compassion and your comfort at that time is so rewarding to us in our grief, because it's so hard to let go of our loved ones." You know, so that's the way it is. I guess you all stayed alive through the whole thing. If not, I'm still licensed, just stay in your chair till it's over, okay? Any other questions? Yes?
How long is mortuary school?
Mortuary school has changed a lot. When I went, I could use a lot of my academic degree to take some of the courses. At that time, it was 1 year for me and 1 year of residency. Then it changed to 2 years of mortuary school and 1 year of residency. They now have a 4-year program and 1 year of residency. But you can still get it in 2 years, and a great deal of it is done online now. And really the main thing is the more you are in the work as a practical, the better you become with the technical aspect of it. And the other stuff you can get, I guess, online. I wouldn't be educated today because I'm so computer illiterate, I couldn't take any courses online, because I would mess up terribly. So I have, all I can do is to use a telephone.
Turn away the circle.
Yes, that's right, that's right. Good question though. Other questions?
What was it that got you interested in being in the funeral business?
To be honest with you, there was one man that got me interested, and I think we've had wonderful funeral directors in Candor. Cloyd is a wonderful funeral director. And, but the one that really got me interested was Myron Miller. And many of you may remember Myron Miller. Myron Miller was a very professional person, but also a down-to-earth human being. And I was best friends with his grandson, Tommy Ward, and we would pal around together, and Myron would say things to us, so when you get old and you lose your teeth, don't forget I've got a whole drawer full. I think, oh my God. And Tommy always told about the time that he rode with him to get a body to a hospital, and Myron put the body on the stretcher in the back of the ambulance or the hearse, whichever it was at the time, because it used to be the ambulance and the hearse. And Myron says, "Oh my God, I forgot something." So he goes back in and brings out the man's wooden leg and throws it back with the body, Myron was always joking, but he was always would answer any questions we had, and was just a real down-to-earth guy that I totally admired. Myron Miller. I think that he I don't know how his wife ever put up with him, but she did for many years. And so Ruth was a great gal too. So that's what sort of got me interested in it. And I just have always had a penchant for helping others in whether it be in the ministry or in the funeral work. So I actually became ordained and licensed as a funeral director all within 18 months of each other. So just remember, I may be the last one to let you down. And with that, I'll close. Thank you. Thank you.